Speaking out, lawmakers visit migrant detention centers on the U.S.-Mexico border. We have a report. Continuing demonstrations, China backs Hong Kong's embattled administration and slams protesters for violence. What faith leaders are saying about the demonstrations. 4th of July, new details from President Donald Trump on the Independence Day celebrations in our nation's capital. And the birthplace of Jesus, a change in status for one of Christianity's most sacred shrines. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, July 2nd, 2019. Good evening from Washington. Thanks for joining us for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Jason Calvi, in for Lauren Ashburn. Democrats say conditions for migrants at the southern border are awful. President Donald Trump signed a bipartisan bill to help, but some lawmakers say it's not enough. White House correspondent Mark Irons tells us more. Mark?
Jason, we're following two big stories, the treatment of migrants and another investigation. The Homeland Security Inspector General will now look into allegations of offensive comments posted in a Facebook group by U.S. border officials. Border Patrol agents reportedly making insensitive remarks about the migrant father and daughter found dead along the Rio Grande, and sexist remarks about Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The head of the U.S. Border Patrol slamming the remarks as completely inappropriate. The president says he hasn't seen them.
Well, I don't know what they're saying about members of Congress. I know that the Border Patrol is not happy with the Democrats in Congress.
Although his focus has been greater border security, the president did sign a bipartisan $4.6 billion aid package to help border officials with the recent migration surge and bolster the care given at detention centers.
We are signing this now, and it's an honor to sign it.
At the same time, Democratic lawmakers inspected the conditions at border facilities themselves.
Children that are sitting and sleeping on the floor.
Another congressman, Joaquin Castro, shot this video of migrant women packed into a cell.
We saw that the system is still broken and that people's human rights are still being abused.
Castro even said one woman spoke of being told to drink water from the toilet due to a lack of running water. A Customs and Border official says that's not true and drinking water is on site. With different priorities, Democrats and the White House have failed to sort out extensive immigration reform. But today, counselor to the president, Kellyanne Conway, told News Nightly she remains hopeful.
We're very happy that this president was able to sign a bipartisan package into law yesterday. I think it tells you something about the softening of the ground for more immigration reform.
Now in the latest legal battle over immigration policy, a migrant advocacy group, the Catholic Legal Immigration Network, is suing to block the Trump administration from enforcing a policy they say would limit asylum protections for immigrant children who come to the U.S. without a guardian. At the White House, Mark Irons, EWTN News Nightly.
And President Trump reacts to Iran breaking limits set by the 2015 nuclear deal.
No message to Iran. They know what they're doing. They know what they're playing with, and I think they're playing with fire. So no message to Iran whatsoever.
French President Emmanuel Macron urged Iran to follow the deal and cut its amount of uranium. This country is one of those still in the nuclear agreement. A top Catholic in the White House is leaving. Mercedes Schlapp works as Director of Strategic Communications. So the question is, where is she going? She tweets, "Thrilled to be joining the president's re-election campaign. Real Donald Trump is the best fighter for the American people we have ever had, and he will be re-elected." Catholic leaders in Hong Kong call for peace. They're urging protesters to stop the violence. Yesterday, hundreds ransacked the government headquarters. Now a top American diplomat condemns the violence. The U.S. Consul General in Hong Kong says he's disappointed about the violence and vandalism. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee reports from the State Department.
Hundreds stormed Hong Kong's Legislative Council building last night. Police fired tear gas to clear out protesters on the 22nd anniversary of Hong Kong's return to Chinese rule. Now, cleanup operations are underway outside and inside the government headquarters. Hong Kong's leader, Carrie Lam, says the protesters who broke in need to respect the rule of law.
With these violent acts that we have seen, it is right for us to condemn it and hope society will return to normal as soon as possible.
Not all of the protests have been violent. Hong Kong residents began marching on June 9th over a controversial bill which would allow extradition to mainland China. Many fear the bill could lead to the arrest of those who oppose the Chinese government. Cardinal Joseph Zen, the Bishop Emeritus of Hong Kong, has been one of those protesting the bill. His Eminence has been a longtime critic of the communist government in Beijing, who he sees as trying to impose their will over the autonomous region. A little over 2 weeks ago, Auxiliary Bishop Joseph Ha warned young people he was worried about their safety. He urged against starting any violence, as it could negatively impact their pro-democracy movement. One protester, Joshua Wong, says the clashes last night could be a setback, but says it's important to remember the hundreds of thousands who didn't attack anyone.
Totally peaceful demonstration with parents bring the kids with baby cars, still peacefully with 500,000 people join the rally.
That was Wyatt Goolsby. Thanks, Wyatt. Australian police arrest 3 men accused of plotting terror attacks.
We obviously have a very serious threat in this country. The fact that now 16 attempted terrorist attacks have been disrupted successfully within our country says to the Australian public that this threat has not diminished, it's not going away.
The suspects lived in Sydney. Police say the men were planning ISIS-style attacks on several targets, including churches. Sri Lankan police arrest their police chief and ex-defense secretary. They're charged with negligence. Terrorists bombed churches and hotels on Easter Sunday. 250 people died. The government admits having warnings about the plot beforehand. And an update on an unsolved mystery at the Vatican. The Vatican will open 2 tombs that could hold secrets about the 1983 disappearance of Emanuele Orlandi. Holy See representatives and the girl's family will be there next week when the graves are opened. The case gained new attention because of an anonymous tip about where the girl might be buried. And the Vatican Secretary of State defends a German captain who brought migrants to Italy. She's charged with ramming a police boat.
Es ist jetzt 11:30 nachts auf der Sea-Watch 3.
Carla Rackit was under house arrest in Italy until this evening. Police arrested her Saturday after her ship docked in Lampedusa, Italy. Her boat was carrying 40 rescued migrants. Italy's interior minister won't let any rescue boats bring migrants to the country. We're joined now by Kishore Jayabalan, director of the Acton Institute's Rome office. He previously worked for the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. Welcome. The Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, defended the migrant ship. He says he believes human life must be saved in any way, so that must be the guiding star, then everything else is secondary. What does that mean in this case?
So the Vatican has clearly taken a purely humanitarian stance on this issue, that the saving of human life is worth the efforts that the NGOs and other humanitarian groups are taking. Unfortunately, I think the problem is that this is a political problem as much as a humanitarian one, and taking a purely humanitarian outlook on this neglects the politics. And the politics of this are important because you have states with borders, with sovereignty, and that to deal with this you need states to work together, which has already been happening, by the way. It's part of the reason why the number of migrants has dropped dramatically in the last year or so, is because Italy and Libya have worked together to reduce the number of migrants taking this very dangerous trip across the Mediterranean.
But in this case, the Vatican is, or at least the Secretary of State in this situation, is siding with someone who broke the law in Italy, correct?
Right, with this, with the humanitarian groups that are trying to bring migrants to Lampedusa, the Italian island closest to Libya, they're actually going against Italian law. And I guess the point is, from a humanitarian perspective, that you're trying to say that the law is less important than the saving of lives. But of course, in a way, the humanitarian groups, what they're doing is siding with the human traffickers, who are of course the people who are profiting off bringing migrants here clandestinely at great risk to the migrants themselves for a profit. So I would prefer to see that the humanitarian groups and even the Holy See work with the governments, because they do have sovereignty, and these are very important issues, and nobody wants to see migrants drowning in the sea. So it's probably better to make sure that the migrants don't leave the coast and engage on these dangerous journeys.
So obviously Italy has sovereignty, but at the same time, these migrants do have the right to at least seek asylum. That's according to the UN Human Rights Declaration. So, I mean, what's the balancing act for Catholics in Italy as they wrestle with this issue?
Well, I think it depends, of course, whom you ask, but I think the average Italian probably understands that the issue is more complicated than just simply let people in because they're asking to come in. There are, of course, different types of international humanitarian law on this. not all migrants qualify for asylum. And I think if you look at some of the video of the migrants that come over, many of them are very reasonable. They say, Italy's right to not allow all of us to come in. We're not all asylum seekers. Some of them are coming for economic reasons. And of course, we should try to welcome people if we can, if we have jobs for them, if we have places for them, as well as trying to help economies grow in sub-Saharan Africa, because that can often be a big push factor when it comes to migration. But at the same time, it's very complicated. Nobody thinks that we can allow in all migrants, just because they'd like to come here. And the Italian economy, of course, is not very strong. It's not easy for Italians to get jobs, so it's not going to make things much easier for the migrants if they come here and have to panhandle and beg for their sustenance.
I'm really intrigued because I know you worked at the Vatican, now you work at a think tank, Acton. What are the challenges when the Vatican has when it comes to dealing with immigration and really balancing this issue, all these issues that you're bringing up right now?
Well, I mean, the Vatican diplomats are used to dealing with complicated issues. I also worked for the Holy See mission at the United Nations, and I'm quite aware of the sophistication of the Vatican diplomatic corps. It's not so much that that there's so many issues to deal with and they can't deal with them. It's that on this particular issue, they've taken a particularly strong humanitarian stance and making the politics seem less important. But at the same time, I think, when Pope Francis went to Poland for World Youth Day in 2016, he met with the Polish bishops behind closed doors. And it's relatively well known that the Polish bishops said that we simply can't let people in without some kind of a criterion, whether they are seeking asylum or here for economic reasons. And countries have different ways of dealing with migration. And I think that has tempered the Pope's tone. I think Cardinal Parolin has expressed his willingness to discuss this matter with the Italian Interior Ministry and to come up with a reasonable political solution. But again, you can't neglect the politics of this. And I think sometimes the humanitarian aspect outweighs the politics in an exaggerated fashion.
Okay, well, Kishore Jayabalan, director of the Acton Institute's Rome office, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Coming up, salute to America, President Trump's plans for the 4th of July. Thanks for watching EWTN News Nightly. I'm Jason Calvi, in for Lauren Ashburn. A 4th of July celebration with speeches, fireworks, and tanks. President Trump's getting ready to celebrate the 4th of July.
It's going to be about this country, and it's a salute to America. And I'm going to be here, and I'm going to say a few words, and we're going to have planes going overhead, the best fighter jets in the world, and other planes too. And we're going to have some tanks stationed outside.
A U.S. government official says a few tanks and armored vehicles will join the Salute to America. But not everyone is on board with the tanks. The District of Columbia government earlier complained tanks would damage city streets. The city council now tweets, "We have said it before, we'll say it again. Tanks, but no tanks." Joining me now to take a look at this is John Gizzi, White House correspondent for Newsmax. John, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
So you've covered Democrats, Republican administrations, 15 years you've been in the White House. What do you make of people complaining the president's politicizing what's normally a bipartisan event?
When you've been in the White House 15 years and you've been a Washington correspondent for nearly 40, one thing you find is that stories seem to echo previous stories. I know that in 1971, President Nixon had Honor America Day on the 4th of July with patriotic celebrations nationwide, and it also invited people on the other side, saying he was trying to change the traditional 4th of July celebration. In addition, we've seen in the past many people criticize the idea that tanks and planes are going to be used. Don Bacon, congressman from Nebraska and himself a retired Marine general, said, "This is not the way Americans celebrate 4th of July." Ditto for Colonel Jack Brennan, who was President Nixon's Marine advisor. Those who have been the most around tanks and planes and no combat say there's another way to say happy birthday to America.
Why were they opposed to it back then, the tanks and the planes?
Well, simply because the United States is a nation that stands up for freedom in the world and yet does not resort to force unless it's needed. It takes Pearl Harbor, or it takes an action like Desert Storm when a small country is threatened, to have our men and women in uniform go into combat and bring out the tanks. For the most part, we're a peace-abiding nation, and that's why we're the leader of the free world.
So there are worries about the costs for this salute with the tanks and the planes. What do you make of the costs?
Well, the costs, that's something that's there, never mentioned, but it almost certainly will cost more to bring in the martial equipment in the nation's capital. In addition, we find the fact that the city fathers here, and as a resident of the district, I know well how our mayor and city council worry about possible damage to the city streets. So there's concern on that.
Are the roads good enough anyway as it is right now? We've got potholes left and right here in the district. I want to turn to North Korea, this historic meeting between the president and Kim Jong-un on Sunday. Is this just a photo op, or will real peace come from these sorts of meetings?
I've been watching North Korea closely since Jimmy Carter went over as a private citizen to talk to the grandfather of the dear leader, and that was Kim Il-sung, the very first leader of North Korea, handpicked by Joseph Stalin for the job. And the fact is that all too often we've had the promise that missile launches would be stopped, and it never really amounts to anything. I remember when the father of the current leader, on the 4th of July, as a matter of fact, while George Bush was president, launched Dung missiles shortly after promising to talk. There's a long history, and I would say I'd like to see some actions on the part of the Pyongyang government. Right now I've seen words, and they don't amount to much.
Okay, well, we'll see what happens. We'll be monitoring that. John Gizzi, White House correspondent for Newsmax, thanks so much for your time.
Always a pleasure to be on EWTN. Thanks for having me.
Up next, amid talk of student loan forgiveness on the campaign trail, an education policy analyst gives us his thoughts. And a change in status for the church at the birthplace of Jesus. Thanks for staying with us. I'm Jason Calvi, in for Lauren Ashburn. The U.S. Supreme Court will hear a case involving school choice. It'll look at whether states like Montana can deny tax credits for families choosing religious schools. The justices will weigh the case in the next term, which starts in October. $1.6 trillion, that's the total of student loan debt in this country, and those loans follow borrowers well beyond graduation day. The policy journal Education Next reports 37% of U.S. adults ages 18 to 29 carry student loan debt, as do 22% of adults aged 30 to 44. Christian Barnard, education policy analyst at the Reason Foundation, joins me now to take a look at this. Christian, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me on.
So we've got some senators, we got some presidential candidates talking about student loan forgiveness, including Bernie Sanders. He wants to forgive all student loan debt. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's bad policy to basically give out a massive entitlement only on the basis of how much debt somebody has, student loan debt in this case. Because a lot of the debt is held by people who have higher level degrees. A lot of the borrowing was done by students who were going to elite schools. So if you want to manage the problem of expensive colleges, I think you need to get to the root of the issue. Student loan forgiveness is basically not tackling the root of the issue, and it's in a way rewarding poor financial decision making.
Is the root of the issue here the increased cost? I mean, I think it was William Bennett, former Secretary of Education. He said when you offer more and more scholarships and grant programs, then colleges start charging more money. Is that the root cause?
That's right. So there's a lot of evidence that the kind of artificial saturation in federal aid that has actually been captured. So as you've increased aid to these colleges, they've been able to capture a lot of that, sometimes up to 65 cents for every additional federal dollar that's offered. So that's part of the problem. But yeah, the institutions themselves, tuition has more than doubled since the 80s. I think the problem is they don't really have any skin in the game, so they can keep charging more and more. And what's happening is there's starting to be a bigger disconnect between what the labor market can bear, right, and what these colleges are charging. So the return on investment is plummeting. So I want to see colleges be held responsible by alternative financing methods that actually make it so that they want to invest in the programs that benefit their kids, their students and their alumni, and maybe pull away from administrative bloat or the other things that are driving costs up and not actually benefiting kids down the line.
So let's talk about some of those alternatives. I know one of the proposals you propose is from Purdue University, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so these are income sharing agreements. So what this does is, like I was mentioning before, realign the incentives in that way. So So rather than traditional student loans, a group of private investors or the college itself will basically foot the bill for a student's education, and based on their major and the university that they're at, what they'll do is pay a fixed portion of their future income over the next 10, 15 years. So as their income goes up, the payment goes up, right? So what this does is makes it so investors are going to invest in the programs that they have a reasonable expectation will pay for those kids down the line. That way, these universities actually have skin in the game. It's very different from the really cheap credit federal loan and federal aid market that you have now for students, which has been a big part of the problem for why we are where we're at now.
So that's one of the alternatives, is this proposal where private investors invest in the program and helps these children, these young people. But I want to talk about the poor people that might be helped with the student loan forgiveness, and people having struggles. They have hundreds of thousands of dollars in debts if they went to medical school, law school, their spouse as well. They can't get a house. They can't. So shouldn't why shouldn't the government get involved in saying, okay, we're going to wipe out your debt?
Well, so wiping out the debt is such poor targeting for those kinds of students. I think there's definitely a conversation that can be had about income-based repayments, right? This is a very widely available option for students whose college education is not paying dividends for them now. So it's kind of similar. It readjusts their repayment plans to look like an income sharing agreement that I was just discussing. But yeah, there's certainly a conversation to be had about targeting the kids who have maybe gone to schools and have a lot of debt, who are poor, who might not have had all the information at their disposal to make wise decisions. But eliminating all student loan debt would only a small sliver of that kind of entitlement program would actually help those students. So we can have a conversation about helping the poor students, but you don't need to include basically this giant welfare program for the rich to do that.
But you win some votes by saying to millennials,
Exactly.
I'm going to forgive your loan. So we'll see what happens. Thank you so much, Christian Barnard, Education Policy Analyst. Thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it very much. And finally tonight, some good news for one of the most important Christian sites in the world. A United Nations agency says the Church of the Nativity is no longer in danger. They no longer consider the 4th century structure an endangered World Heritage Site. That's thanks to extensive restoration work. The church was built over a cave tradition says is where the Blessed Virgin Mary gave birth to Jesus. And I'm Jason Calvi, and for the entire EWTN News Nightly team, thanks for watching tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless you.